The operation should have unfolded like dozens of other Allied airborne drops in the later years of the Second World War. Fast, coordinated, meticulously timed. But the night that gave birth to this story was neither orderly nor predictable. A sudden crosswind, a drifting formation, and a single misread beacon turned one paratrooper's descent into a fall across the invisible edge of a border. He was meant to land inside a designated drop zone cleared by reconnaissance and marked by friendly pathfinders. Instead, he emerged from the darkness into a forest belonging to a country no one in his unit had planned to enter. The mission clock continued ticking, but from the moment his boots hit foreign soil, nothing went according to plan. He realized it immediately. Trees too dense, terrain too uneven, silence too complete. This wasn't the corridor the pre-mission maps had outlined. His unit somewhere miles away was scattering under the wind's pull, but he had no way of knowing if any of them were nearby. When he cut himself free from the shroud of his tangled parachute, the first sounds he heard were branches shifting under the weight of a cold breeze. The second was far worse. Distant engines, the rhythm of an enemy patrol circling a route that shouldn't have existed anywhere near his intended landing zone. His training took over long before fear could. He withdrew into the trees and buried himself under the broken shadows until the patrol faded. His supply container hadn't landed with him. That meant no explosives, no extra ammunition, and no radio. He moved through the forest on instinct, searching for anything the wind might have dropped. What he found were pieces, torn silk, snapped straps, crushed wooden cases. Most were empty. A single crate yielded a half-filled bandolier and a demolition charge packed in a rubber sleeve. It was nothing close to what he needed, but it was enough to remain dangerous, enough to matter if he used it at the right time, in the right place. He needed orientation. The dark made the forest feel endless, but by sunrise he could finally study the terrain. Ravines carved the ground into uneven cuts, and the ridges hid movement while amplifying sound. This was enemy territory, but not the part Allied intelligence had mapped. He had been pushed too far east. A misdrop of several miles in the chaos of wartime airborne operations wasn't unusual. Scores of paratroopers in World War II had landed far from their intended coordinates, but crossing an entire national frontier was something else. And in this theater, borders meant jurisdiction, patrol patterns, and resistance networks that operated under entirely different chains of command. It didn't take long before he spotted the first sign confirming his mistake. A shattered wooden signpost, half buried in the earth, marked a district name he recognized only from intelligence briefings, one governed tightly under Axis occupation. He was alone, unaccounted for, and situated in a region no Allied paratrooper was scheduled to enter for at least another month. If captured, he wouldn't be processed as a soldier in a known operation. He would simply vanish into a system where paperwork existed only to bury identities. But missions didn't dissolve just because conditions changed. The demolition objective he was originally assigned, to cripple a railway line feeding enemy reinforcements to the front, still mattered. He just had no idea where the closest rail artery ran from this unfamiliar side of the border. His only advantage was the chaos that defined much of the Second World War's nighttime airborne operations. Disorganization could be fatal, but it could also be a cloak. He moved carefully, tracing the slope of the terrain, listening for mechanical vibration that might hint at trains. Hours later, he heard one, a low, droning hum rolling through the hills. He followed it, keeping his silhouette low, pushing through undergrowth until the forest thinned enough to reveal the steel lines swallowing distance in both directions. He watched the rail for long minutes, No guards, no signals nearby. It was a supply route, not a troop movement corridor. Still valuable, still vulnerable. But one man with a partial charge couldn't cut an artery like this cleanly. Not without help. The resistance found him before he found them. At first, he mistook the whispers behind him for another patrol. But when he drew his weapon, a pair of hands emerged, palms facing outward, followed by a figure wearing civilian rags but standing with a soldier's posture. The underground movement in this region had been operating longer than the Allies realized. Small, fractured but efficient. They had watched him since dawn, unsure whether he was a German infiltrator, an Allied straggler, or a liability. When he answered their test questions, the kind only an Allied paratrooper could know, they brought him into the ruins they used as a temporary shelter. Communication was impossible beyond a narrow radius. Radios were a luxury this cell didn't possess. But they understood the railway mattered. The guerrillas had long wanted to damage it but lacked explosives reliable enough to achieve more than superficial sabotage. The paratrooper's demolition knowledge, combined with the single charge he carried, gave them a rare opportunity. They studied maps drawn from memory, argued over distances, and finally identified a section of the line where a blast would be both catastrophic and slow to repair. The plan depended on timing. Enemy convoys had begun increasing movement through this corridor due to pressure on the Western Front. One such convoy, carrying ammunition and fuel, was expected before dusk. The paratrooper volunteered to place the charge alone. He was trained for this, and he didn't want the resistance members exposed any more than necessary. They agreed reluctantly, giving him only what they could spare: a knife, a local insignia to help him blend in from a distance, and a whispered blessing drawn from the old folklore of the region. He moved fast. From the forest ridge, he observed the valley, studied the routine of the track walkers, memorized the blind spots in their patrol. When the moment came, he descended in silence, crawling through the wet soil beneath the sloped embankment. The demolition pack fit snugly against the base of a structural brace. Not enough to destroy the entire line, but enough to collapse a section when weight rolled over it. Enough to halt trains for days. He detonated it from a distance by severing the safety wire and letting the trigger fall under tension. The explosion thundered through the valley, ripping steel and tossing gravel like shrapnel. Flames rose from a ruptured tanker before the echo had even faded. Enemy patrols converged almost instantly, and he retreated into the high brush, sprinting toward the tree line as machine gun tracers swept the hillside. He should have escaped cleanly. But the enemy had already begun tightening the noose around the area, and within minutes he was caught between converging units. Gunfire snapped across the trees, splintering bark inches from his head. He returned fire only when absolutely necessary, moving from trunk to trunk, conserving every round. The fight dragged into the forest's deeper shadows. As the flames on the railway dimmed behind him, he stumbled into the ruins of a stone outbuilding and crouched inside, listening as boots stomped through the corridors of dead leaves. He waited. Minutes, then longer. Only when the patrols drifted away did he move again, slipping through the underbrush until the forest began to thin and the land opened into shallow fields. He was battered, exhausted, alone, but alive. And somewhere beyond the smoke rising from the destroyed rail line, across a frontier he had crossed by accident and survived by sheer adaptability. The Allied forces were advancing. They didn't know he was here. They didn't know the damage he had caused. But the reports that would reach them soon, delayed convoys, disrupted supply chains, enemy confusion, would tell the story well enough. He had to reach them. But the frontier was still ahead, and the war was far from finished. Dawn brought a gray, heavy sky, the kind that flattened distance and made every ridge look the same. The paratrooper pushed on anyway, moving west toward the approximate direction of the original drop zone. He had no map, only the fragments of terrain memory collected during briefings and what he had learned the hard way over the past day. The forest thinned as he walked, giving way to broken fields and the remnants of battle long past. Charred trenches, rusting wire, and shattered posts leaning like gravestones. This territory had changed hands more than once since the early years of World War II, and the scars showed it. He stopped only when he saw movement on a nearby slope. A pair of enemy scouts, rifles on their backs, cutting across the fields as if searching for traces of a ghost. They weren't here by chance. The railway explosion had sent ripples through command, and every soldier within marching distance had been thrown into the hunt. The paratrooper dropped to the dirt and crawled into a shallow depression until the scouts passed out of sight. Then he kept moving, slower now, calculating every step. Hours later, he reached the first true landmark he recognized from his training dossier. An old frontier signpost, splintered and half-collapsed, marking the boundary between two occupied districts. The carved lettering was barely legible, but it was enough. This was the border he wasn't supposed to cross, the threshold that separated his unintended landing from the actual operational theater. He rested his hand on the weathered wood for a moment, letting the reality sink in. He had survived the wrong country. Now he needed to survive the right one. As he pressed forward, smoke rose from the horizon, thick columns drifting upward like the breath of something ancient stirring in the distance. It wasn't industrial smoke. It was battlefield smoke. That meant the front was closer than he'd realized. Artillery thunder echoed in the distance, rolling across the hills in slow, relentless waves. Allied pressure on this sector had increased over the past week, part of a larger push that command hoped would collapse enemy logistics feeding the central line. The paratrooper adjusted his grip on his rifle and accelerated. The closer he got to the advancing front, the better his odds. By mid-afternoon, he saw them, figures moving through the haze, rifles raised, helmets unmistakably Allied. He didn't step into view immediately. Caution was instinct. He circled wide, scanning for flanking units, ensuring he wasn't walking into another occupied pocket. Only when he recognized the silhouettes and heard the clipped rhythm of English commands did he emerge from the brush. The first soldiers to spot him nearly fired. His uniform was coated in mud and ash, his insignia obscured. But when he raised his hands and gave his unit designation, the tension broke instantly. His reunion with the nearest company was brief and understated. The officer in charge listened to his explanation with growing disbelief, then sent him under escort to battalion headquarters. There, amid piles of field reports and messengers rushing in and out, the paratrooper repeated the story. The misdrop, the unintentional border crossing, the resistance cell, the railway sabotage, the firefight, and the route he took to reach them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the battalion commander pointed to a set of papers stacked on a table. Enemy messages intercepted the previous night. Among them was a frantic dispatch reporting the destruction of a critical supply convoy and a rail collapse that had triggered mass logistical confusion. The paratrooper's single charge had succeeded where larger operations often struggled. It had cut fuel flow to armored divisions positioned just east of the current Allied advance. It had forced the enemy to reroute ammunition through slower, more vulnerable corridors. And perhaps most importantly, it had created a gap, small, temporary, but real, in the enemy's defensive timetable. The commander stared at him with the quiet recognition common among men who had seen plans fall apart enough times to understand how rare such opportunities were. He was escorted to the rear, given food, water, and a medical inspection. Aside from bruises, cuts, and exhaustion, he was intact. Soldiers in the camp listened to fragments of his story with a mixture of amusement and awe. They'd all known of paratroopers who landed miles from their targets, during D-Day, during Operation Market Garden, during countless smaller jumps scattered across the Second World War. But crossing an entire national frontier and completing a demolition objective anyway? That was new. Later that evening, he was taken before a small field command group where senior officers reviewed updated intelligence grids on a map lit by dim lanterns. They questioned him sharply. Details, distances, timing, the resistance cell's location, the patrol patterns he'd observed. Everything he said was marked, compared, and cross-referenced with reconnaissance notes. When they finished, one of the officers closed the folder with a decisive motion. "You weren't supposed to be there," he said, "but the result speaks for itself." The next day, Allied units advanced toward the shaken sector. Enemy troops, deprived of critical supplies, pulled back faster than anticipated. Reports filtered in describing abandoned vehicles, disorganized command posts, and units scrambling to adjust to the sudden logistical failure. The paratrooper watched the movements from a transport truck as he was moved further to the rear for debriefing and reassignment. He felt distant from it all, numb, hollow in that strange way that came after adrenaline had burned out and only the memory remained. When the war finally recounted the events of that week, it did so with the dry precision of military documentation. The railway incident was recorded without flourish. Sabotage action causing interruption of convoy movement. The resistance support was noted as unverified. The paratrooper's misdrop was described as geographical displacement due to meteorological interference. Nowhere did the documents capture the reality. A single man landing in the wrong country, improvising in total isolation, and striking a blow that rippled across an entire front. Months later, long after he had been reassigned to a different unit, a sealed, declassified airborne file would confirm what frontline whispers already knew. His unintended detour had been one of the most consequential single-soldier disruptions to enemy logistics in that entire sector. A mistake had become an advantage, a misdrop had become an operation, and a lone paratrooper cut off from his own side had carried the weight of a mission that wasn't his but mattered all the same. In the vast ledger of World War II, most stories of airborne troops followed predictable patterns: jumps, chaos, regrouping, combat, return. But scattered among them were anomalies, instances where chance collided with resolve and produced outcomes no planner could have scripted. This was one of those moments. A reminder that in the Second World War, with its maps, commands, and strategies, some of the most decisive actions came from men operating far beyond the boundaries of expectation. And in the years that followed, as the archives opened and wartime reports were sifted by historians searching for meaning in the noise, one line stood out above the rest. Sometimes the war was changed not by the missions that went as planned, but by the soldiers who refused to be defined by the ones that didn't.